Lubricate or allocate. Coase versus Hobbes. The Coase and Hobbes theorems characterize two ways that law can increase efficiency when transaction costs are positive. First, law can lubricate private exchange by lowering transaction costs. Second, law can allocate rights to the party who values them the most. Now, we consider how a lawmaker might choose between lubricating and allocating. Return to our example of the farmer and the rancher, where fencing costs the rancher $75 and the farmer $50. Assume that the law assigns the obligation to fence to the rancher's farmer's rights. Given these facts, a surplus of $25 could be achieved by transferring the obligation to fence from the rancher to the rancher's rights. Assume, however, that transaction costs of private exchange equal $35, so the transfer is blocked. What is to be done? If law can lower the transaction cost of exchange from $35 to $10, the transaction costs will no longer block private exchange. When private exchange is not blocked, the obligation of the rancher to build the fence can be transferred to the farmer, thus creating a net benefit of $15. Alternatively, assume that the law cannot lower the transaction costs of exchange. The other possible remedy is to change the law and assign the obligation to fence the farmer-rancher's rights, not the rancher-farmer's rights. If the farmer has the obligation to fence, the legal rights are allocated efficiently. When the right is already allocated efficiency, exchange of the right would produce a negative surplus. Exchange is unnecessary and will not occur. Unfortunately, however, lawmakers often do not know who values rights the most, and finding out can be difficult. To illustrate, consider the problem of finding out the cost of fencing the farmer's crops. When testifying in court, the farmer has an incentive to exaggerate these costs. Knowing this fact, the judge and the jury are not sure whether to believe the farmer. Lawmakers with limited information face a trade-off between transaction costs and information costs. On one hand, by strictly following precedent, courts avoid information costs of determining who values the right the most. With strict adherence to precedent by courts, the parties must bear the transaction costs of correcting inefficient legal allocations of rights. On the other hand, the courts can attempt to determine who values a legal right the most and adjust the law accordingly. With legal reallocation of rights, the courts or other lawmakers must bear the information costs of determining who values a right the most. Efficiency requires the courts to do whichever is cheaper. To formalize this claim, let capitals IC denote the information cost to a court of determining who values a legal right the most. Let capitals TC indicate the transaction costs of trading legal rights. Efficient courts would follow this rule. Information costs are lower than transaction costs. Then allocate the legal right initially to the person who values it the most. If transaction costs are less than information costs, strictly follow precedent. To illustrate the application of this principle, as population increases and land use intensifies, areas in the western United States convert from open to closed range. Assume that a judge or panel of legal experts must consider whether to leave some range in the country open or to close it. In approaching the question, the judge or commission should balance the transaction costs of private bargains between ranchers and farmers and the cost to lawmakers of trying to determine the fencing costs of ranchers and farmers. Question 4.11. A. When transaction costs are low enough, efficient resource allocation will follow regardless of the particular assignment of property rights. When transaction costs are high enough, efficient resource allocation requires assigning property rights to the party who values them the most. Give an example of each case. B. Can you use the normative Hobbes theorem to justify legislation regulating the collective bargaining process between employers and employee unions? C. When people strongly disagree, they may try to harm each other, or they may walk away from a potentially profitable exchange. What does the normative Hobbes theorem suggest the response of the law should be to these two possibilities?